Hello, just confirming I am visible and audible.
Yep.
Awesome. Then if everyone is ready to start. Incredibly proud to propose, the United States federal government should impose a significant pay floor for nurses in the United States. On framing, we propose weighing this debate on a cost-benefit analysis to all individuals involved. So our plan is that the United States federal government should impose a $60,000 pay floor for nurses in the United States, and the US government would increase subsidies for nurse wages. In the status quo, nurses everywhere are underpaid, but nurses in smaller states are underpaid the most. For example, LVN in Mississippi makes on average $39,000 a year. This plan would ensure that nurses across the nation would be properly compensated, as we would impose the $60,000 pay floor. If the price floor was made, adjustments for more expensive areas would also follow suit with compensation. It's time to make sure that nurses everywhere have a livable wage. Our actor is the US federal government, our agent of enforcement is the Department of Health and Human Services, our timeframe is as soon as possible, and our funding is through normal ways and means. Our contention one is mitigating medical labor shortages. The first link is attracting people to nursing and maintaining current nurses. The issue is not what hospitals can afford in the status quo, but the absence of people wanting to work in healthcare. Recognize that working as a nurse is uniquely taxing, so imposing this pay floor would incentivize more people to pursue things such as medical school to ensure that they can actually work in this position in the first place, because there's more incentive to do so. The second link under this argument is preventing brain drain from rural states. The most dramatic shortage that we have seen is in rural areas. A significant number of rural hospitals have shut down due to a lack of medical staff. People in rural areas go to medical clinics which have the least and have the worst health outcomes. One of the reasons for this is that medical personnel are moving from rural areas to cities to make a livable wage and a higher wage. And they are moving out of poor states like Mississippi, contributing to a cycle of worse and worse health outcomes. The third link here is making sure that inner city hospitals and hospitals in high minority areas have people working there. So one of the biggest places of closure, additionally, has been inner city hospitals. One of the reasons for this is that their pay is lower than the pay in suburban hospitals, but realize that our plan solves for that by setting a universal pay floor. So hospitals like Cedars Sinai in a wealthy area pay nurses more, whereas hospitals in inner cities just don't pay as much. For this reason, people in inner cities and minorities have lower health outcomes. The internal link is that nurses in hospitals across the country will be justly compensated for their work. This will increase the aggregate nursing population and ensure that nurses return to rural and inner city hospitals. The impact here was very simple. Mitigating healthcare worker shortages contributes to better quality care across the country, but also it decreases health inequality. By decreasing this inequality, you allow people in rural areas and adversely affected minorities to have longer lives and better overall health outcomes. I'll take that point.
Right. Where's the actual pay coming from? Like, if you're increasing the pay gap, where's the money coming from to fund these like rural areas?
Yeah, so we think that this is through normal ways and means, which is derived from a semblance of the status quo. In the status quo, hospitals are obviously paying their healthcare workers, but in instances such as rural hospitals, there are tons of subsidies from the federal government to take care of extraneous costs. Onto our contention two, which is benefits to patients. The first link is reducing hospital strikes. Medical workers, most often nurses, organize in unions and engage in demonstrations of protest in the status quo because of their legitimate underpay and burnout. They're simply not paid by hospitals enough, and we recognize on government that there is a legitimate incentive to engage in things like strikes because of this. But the issue with strikes is that it can put patients in hospitals at risk for the time that nurses are in strikes. There is a temporary exacerbation of the lack of healthcare workers, and the quality of care dramatically suffers as a result. So if you are sick, you simply might not be able to receive care right away because the workers are on strike at the time. So how do we solve for this here? Our plan quite literally provides nurses what they legitimately need, while avoiding the dangerous prevalence of healthcare strikes in the status quo. That's very important for maintaining a stable worker base in hospitals. The second link here to benefits to patients is reducing worker turnover. This is very important for two reasons. First of all, hospitals do not need to spend more money in retraining nurses. And second, most importantly, Nurses gain more institutional knowledge and expertise because they work in their positions for longer spans of time. So how do we exactly reduce turnover? It's quite intuitive again. At the point at which you increase the pay of nurses, you incentivize them to stay in their job because they're actually living a livable wage. They're not experiencing as much burnout. The impacts here is very simple again, the quality of care for patients. So the point at which you're not having hospital strikes happening so often, when you're not experiencing massive worker turnover, which is destroying the institutional knowledge that is accumulated within these nurses, you are ensuring that the care that these receive increase in the health in the United States overall. That leads us to our third contention, which is protecting nurses. The first link is the poor quality of life that nurses uniquely face in the status quo. Because of their demanding workload in a high-stress environment, nurses experience a multitude of effects, including emotional turmoil, physical deterioration, and social isolation. Note that nurses are also 5 times more likely to experience workplace violence. This is why they are so prone to burnout, because of the hellish conditions that they can often experience. We like to characterize nurses as an extremely vulnerable actor. The second link is improving nurse quality of life. So how exactly do we provide solvency here? We think that this argument is quite intuitive. Again, there are 4 reasons why we do this. First, when nurses are paid more, that typically means that they don't have to work such long shifts at a time to meet their financial needs and their financial burdens. That directly addresses burnout and their low quality of life. Secondly, nurses will have more luxury to afford basic necessities, which improves their quality of life in general. They're able to put more food on the table, pay their bills, things like that, so on and so forth. Thirdly, nurses will have more financial stability overall in the long term, which will undoubtedly address much of the mental anxiety and stress they experience, reducing burnout overall and just increasing their quality of life because they don't have to work, for example, like part-time jobs or things like that. Fourthly is the appreciation metric. We think that increasing pay for nurses in society inherently makes them more recognized as valuable workers, and that improves things like career satisfaction. It's seen as a valuable and worthwhile job by our society that not only makes these nurses feel like they are being appreciated, but also incentivizes more people to work in such a position. The impacts are very simple again. We believe that nurses are very vulnerable stakeholders in this debate, and our side protects them by giving them adequate career satisfaction, improving their quality of life, ensuring that they're not experiencing things like massive burnout. So that benefits the most vulnerable actors as we characterize. But you can even extrapolate those benefits to benefits for patients, because at the point at which your nurses are happy, your nurses are stable and they're not suffering mental repercussions, you're not going to be having low quality of care. At that point, very proud to propose for all stakeholders in this debate.
Okay, for the judge, a brief off-time roadmap. I'll first be going over initial refutations and brief refutations for the opposition side. Then I'll be going over initial refutations on the gov side. Then I'll be going over the opposition case, the counterplan, 2 disadvantages, and our main advantage. If everyone's ready, get my timer. First, on framing, our opponents claim cost-benefit analysis for the framing mechanism for this round. We agree this seems like a fair thing to say. They specifically have a little bit of lack of clarity within how exactly this money is getting to people. They say that there's a $60,000 pay floor across the entire U.S. federal government, but they don't specify exactly where the money is coming from. They say that it's normal means and methods, but they don't specify whether it's a pay gap similar to minimum wage or whether it's direct subsidies from the U.S. federal government. You can't have be claiming that it's both, and it's a little bit difficult to refute when you have an inherent lack of clarity because they're different things. Secondly, we're going to say that substantially increase pay floor. $60,000 would not be a substantial increase of pay for nurses, specifically because the average salary in California and states like that, most of the U.S. states have an average salary of $78K to $170,000 for nurses, or $61 an hour. So this wouldn't actually be topical within the resolution because it's not a significant increase in pay for nurses in most states in the United States. So it would have to be a much larger increase in pay. Okay, on their first point about labor shortages, they basically say that there's brain drain, one from rural areas, and you have more of an incentive when it's higher paying. in like these areas. However, we say the main reason right now that nurses and other like doctors are fleeing from these rural areas is because of the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Essentially, rural doctors know that in these areas, it's much more likely that they're not actually going to be able to practice their medicine. And in some cases, they could even be held legally accountable for performing abortions and other life-saving technologies. That is the primary driving factor of flight from rural areas right now. Secondly, they say that inner city hospitals and areas like this will get more funding. But once again, we say, where does the pay actually come from? If they're claiming that it's like specifically like, oh, the hospitals have the money, the hospitals don't have the money in the status quo to actually pay their staff enough, which is why they don't get paid enough. So you can't just say, okay, we're going to implement like a pay floor. That means they'll just have to lay off more nurses. They're not going to be able to magically get money. If they say it's coming from subsidies for the federal government, we say they don't specify exactly how these subsidies will work, one. And two, that would be like economically basically like impossible, because that is like a ton of money to be spending across the entire United States to subsidize a $60,000 for every single nurse from the federal government. I'll take a point.
So not all nurses work in abortion services. How can you say that all rural disparities only exist solely because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade?
I'm not saying that all exist because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I'm saying that the statistics that you are citing in your uniqueness, that people are flighting away from rural areas, is right now being caused by Roe v. Wade. You can't claim it's something else just because people are fleeing away from these rural areas. And secondly, you don't actually provide any like new money to these rural areas, so it doesn't matter anyway. And then specifically about they talk about patients like health, how this will be addressed within our like our case, because we're basically solving for the same issues. Secondly, about protecting nurses point, they talk about how there's like high stress and violence. We agree there is something like this, but we say that one, for their 4 points, they say first they're like nurses will reduce the length of their shifts. We say that this just simply won't happen because like nurses already are in residency. They have to like spend all their time in the hospital. So they're not going to be like spending more time at home because of this. You're just getting more like paid. If it's not hourly, so you can't reduce your hours by a contract. $60,000 a year is salary. That's not hourly. So you couldn't reduce your contract. And secondly, they talk about luxury and financial stability, which will help mental health. But we say that mental or like having more money doesn't decrease that offset and like stress that you have. You can't just say, oh, you have more money, now you're happy. It doesn't work like that. They're still in the same exact high stress, violent environments. Just because the fact that they have more money doesn't offset that. On to our case. First, we negate and we oppose with a counterplan. The U.S. federal government should increase the mandatory paid time off and benefits by implementing a 4-day work week specifically. So this would be through normal means and methods as well, like through the regulatory agencies. And specifically on mutual exclusivity here, we say it's impossible to do both plans because of economic collapse. Like if you're creating a pay floor and also increasing the paid time off, it would lead to basically most nurses wouldn't be able to be like accurately or you wouldn't be able to fund them because hospitals only have so many resources. But we're saying that of the two, paid time off would have like much greater benefits to the actual nurses rather than just giving them more money. So first, on the disadvantage for their case, cost of living inequity. If you have a minimum pay gap federally mandated, it would affect different states differently. No, thank you. Since they have different costs of living. For example, California is 33% more expensive to live in than like a state like Idaho. So at like a logistical level, mandating that there's a minimum pay gap at the federal level just makes no sense whatsoever. Use common sense, Judge. Secondly, wages to be matched to the state. And the way that we can do this is through paid time off. When you have paid time off, it's a given amount of time that is required, which adapts to the wages. So if you have like an hour or a given amount of time off, it's the same for every state and doesn't suffer from this issue of cost of living, where it just wouldn't benefit any kind of nurses in like high income areas. Now, our second disadvantage is about inflation. No, thank you. A minimum pay gap would lead to skyrocketing inflation. And quote, raising minimum wage artificially creates imbalances in the labor market and leads to inflation, according to Hayes 22. We are currently on the brink of a recession. Runaway inflation is already at 5%. It was 8% last year. It's clear that we can't afford to pass right this second, as our opponents say, like something that will increase inflation so much. It can trigger recession. Look to the bank collapses in Silicon Valley. It's clear that we are in like a try or die situation where we don't want to be implementing a pay gap. And now an advantage for our case is specifically that it increases benefits like for nurses. One, the 4-day work week has been empirically proven to be beneficial all around. The world's largest 4-day work week study just launched, and it found that basically there's a 92% success rate for reducing stress, reduced 71% reported reduced burnout, less fatigue, mental and physical health increases, 62% found better social life, and in addition to this, there was no harms to productivity. 1.4% higher revenue was earned from everyone participating in this 4-day work week, leading to an overall 35% increase in profits. So it's clear that a 4-day work week simply just works better, both for the mental health of the people participating and for the like employers as well. And in addition, we see this being implemented in other parts of the economy already. Like key fields like firefighting and police already have a mandated 4-day week because they're high stress job mandates that they. Okay, I'll take it.
So the government wouldn't have to spend extra money to give nurses paid time off. You could just pay $60,000 for 4 days a week.
What do you mean? So you're trying to say. No, I don't get what you're trying to say there. I'm just going to keep going on because I have some more stuff to say. Specifically, basically, job stress is a major barrier for health and safety of nurses. 62% felt overwhelmed. Over 34% said that they were not emotionally healthy. And worse patient outcomes leads to like a quality of life decreases. When you have nurses that are able to take off more time, this is like very beneficial in the long term. And according to nursing process, the top reason for nurses leaving jobs is the high physical and mental demand, which means that you will actually have an increase in nurses that are actually doing things. And nurses' ability to care actually drop 5% when they're under more stress. And so for all these reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
Okay. Is everyone ready? I'm assuming everyone's good. If everyone is ready, then I will begin my time now. So first, onto the plan. My opponent says that there's no way that we could actually get this money to the hospitals and they wouldn't be able to pay for it. A couple of problems here. We tell you in our case that we're going to be increasing subsidies that we already see in the status quo. First of all, the government already subsidizes rural hospitals. We see it in this quo. The government actually recently, the Biden-Harris administration cleared $110 million to be given to rural hospitals to increase care. The problem here is that they're not specifying where this money should be going to. Because the plan specifies that we're going to be putting this price floor in place, rural hospitals can allocate the money properly, again, to having these things happen at their hospitals, to having that $60,000 wages for nurses. The problem in the status quo isn't that the money doesn't exist, it's that there's misallocation and it's not going to the right places. The only way to ensure that these hospitals stay in business in inner cities and rural hospitals is to increase the amount of money that these nurses are making in the long run by having this price floor. And that's what we're talking about throughout this, is that by giving them more money, that's how we're going to keep them in this field. That's how people are going to stay in these places, because people are moving out and they're moving out fast. Now, they tell you that $60,000 is not a significant increase because nurses in California make $70K to $180K. Remember, California is the most expensive state in the entire country. Using California as their only example is not going to fly. Beyond that, RNs is typically $70K to $100K, but the majority of nurses are not RNs. The majority are LVNs, or licensed verified nurses, because it's easier to become an LVN. And these are the people that are not being justly compensated. Even if we're looking at RNs, most RNs across the country do not make over $60K. California is the exception because, again, we are the most expensive state to live in. But beyond that, states like Mississippi, Alabama, even in New York City, lower LVNs make less than $60,000. At the end of the day, this is a significant increase considering that we don't have a price floor in the status quo, which is what we're comparing it to, is the fact that we lack one in the status quo. But even if we're looking at real wages in real time, again, they're not being justly compensated in any of these places. But beyond that, we're comparing significant pay floor from the fact that we have a zero pay floor right now too. Now, on our first contention, they tell you that we're not going to be able to solve the problem because doctors are not leaving rural areas because it's expensive or because they're not being paid enough, but it's because they can't practice there. First of all, this is simply patently false. They can practice there. There's no reason why there aren't people there to work with. I mean, they have the lowest the worst health outcomes in the entire country. If anything, there's more people that they can work with in these places and more medical problems that they can treat. But beyond that, they talk about Roe v. Wade, and that's one of the reasons that people are leaving or that the medical personnel are leaving. Not every single medical clinic in these rural areas was abortion clinics. In fact, for the most part, they weren't really abortion clinics because they're typically already in conservative areas. I mean, if we're going to look at the facts, it's not because of Roe v. Wade that they're leaving. This has been a trend for over a decade, and they've always had the worst medical health outcomes. And one of the reasons for that is because they're not justly compensated in these areas. They're only being paid about $37,000 in places like Mississippi and Alabama and other places in the South, and even in Northeast states like Montana. Not Northeast, but North states like Montana. A lot of these states that are not justly compensating these people have worse health outcomes because they can't keep the nurses and they can't keep the medical personnel that they have. At the end of the day, making sure that they'll stay is one of the biggest problems. But beyond that, they didn't touch our first link, which was saying that if we're increasing wages overall for people across the country, and naturally all wages will increase if we have this price floor, we're also going to see an increase in people going into the nursing field in the first place, and which is something that we characterize as one of the biggest problems. One of the reasons that hospitals are failing in the SQO. There simply isn't enough nurses. Even if you look at their counterplan, it's not going to encourage people to go there because at the end of the day, people pursue a job because there's money there, because they can live off of it. But if nursing is not providing a livable wage, people aren't going to go into the field, but this assures that they are giving that wage that is necessary and people will be going into the field. We exclusively get that link. But further, they don't really touch our link on inner city hospitals as well. One of the reasons people are leaving is that suburban hospitals pay more. These hospitals that are mostly attended by white people are paid more. We need to increase pay across the board in order to get people to go. That is the number one factor people choose a job for, is how much does it pay? And at the end of the day, if nursing is not paying enough, they're not going to go there. Hospitals shut down. This links into our second contention as well. Benefits to patient care. Something we talked about was reducing hospital strikes. The majority of hospital strikes are not necessarily for paid time off, but it's for not having enough money to eat. If nurses are not getting paid enough money, if nurses are not receiving just compensation, then they can't put food on the table. It doesn't matter how much paid time off you're giving them. If they can't feed their children, what does it matter? Giving people and nurses a livable wage is what's most important and comes first. We prevent strikes on our side of the house, but beyond that, we reduce worker turnover because they're less likely to seek other careers in our world, and they're less likely to quit the job and less likely to go to other places because they're actually being paid a reasonable amount in the place that they are. Keeping nurses in their jobs is most important in this round. As we've proven, medical labor shortages is why hospitals close. It's why we can have worse care overall. If we can at least prove some ability to actually get nurses in their job and prove that probability, then that probability alone is enough to outweigh anything on their side of their house. Now, on the third contention is protecting nurses. Their really only response here is that they're still going to be in violent environments, but what we're saying is that they need that just compensation. By being compensated justly for what they're going through, again, they have that ability to say that we're getting what we deserve. Even garbage workers, like the people that pick up garbage on the side of the streets, make a significant amount of money. Some of them make more money than nurses. The fact of the matter is, when you work jobs that are harder, you should get paid more. But nurses are not being paid enough for what they're doing, and that's why we're saying we have that appreciation principle there. But beyond that, again, they're more likely to stay in their job, and they're going to have a better quality of life. A lot of their job quality of life has to do with whether or not they're able to feed their children, whether or not they're able to live a good life with enough money. Whether or not they have paid time off doesn't matter if they can't actually use that paid time off with the money that they're earning from work. Now, let's go on to their side of the case. They give you a counter plan. First of all, we can perm some parts of their counter plan. For example, $60K for 4 days a week is possible. Or giving them $60,000 for 4 days a week and then still giving them that paid time off. So again, we can do that as well. And beyond that, nurses would make again, not necessarily a bigger amount of money on their side of the house, which is something that we characterize as the biggest problem in the round. If they're not being paid enough, they're not going to go into nursing, but they're also not going to have that better quality of care. They're not solving the shortage of workers. In fact, they're actually making the problem worse. By saying that they're going to have less or more time off, actually, they're going to exacerbate the medical shortage, which means that there's more closure of hospitals in the long run. I'm sorry, just quickly going back to our contention too. They also talked about how there's an hourly wage problem and that it's based on a year, not an hourly wage. So we're not necessarily going to be actually giving them more time off. But the fact of the matter is, again, if we're going to be looking at this hourly wage problem, we can actually do it to the hour as well. So it's not necessarily a problem, but beyond that, nurses are already assured a certain amount of vacation days off. So that would also be accounted into it, that they have a mandatory amount that they're mandated by the government to give each nurse in vacation time and paid time off. So if we already have that on our side, it's going to be counted into, again, whatever they're making. $60,000 is the floor, including that mandatory time off and sick time off. Now, let's go on to what else they're saying. They're saying that the pay floor makes no sense. It won't work. But again, we already have subsidies in the SQO. It's just about management and making sure that they're put in the right places. Beyond that, the government can afford to invest more in healthcare. There's no reason why they can't. They give no reason why we can't do that. I'm already in protected time. And then on their contention, where they tell you that there's like imbalance or imbalance in the labor market and that it's going to lead to problems. First of all, how are we simultaneously going towards inflation and recession? The two are at opposite sides of the economic spectrum. How are we going towards both? It doesn't make any sense. Beyond that, inflation is settling in the status quo. And furthermore, if we are having inflation, then how come nurses' wages aren't raising? What we're trying to do is that we're trying to meet inflation halfway. In fact, we can turn this argument because we're making sure that they're able to afford the inflation that's happening because their wages have been relatively stagnant. Next, they tell you that there's going to be 4 days as more productive, but that's actually, they don't give a warrant for this. They just say that it exists and hide behind statistics. But this also doesn't work for an aggregate economy where there's an aggregate shortage of workers and nurses in the long run. So overall health quality will be worse. And also hospitals won't have enough people to actually work. So productivity will go down overall. For all these reasons, so proud to oppose.
And then I'll. Oh, there.
Oh yeah, sorry. I'll put that in right now.
I'm gonna get my timer ready and then I'll start. Sorry about, I might have a little lag during the speech, trying to mitigate that, but. Okay. Oh, I'm gonna wait until we get the plans in the chat. Okay, my time will start, or sorry, actually a brief off-time roadmap. I'm just gonna do some refutations, and if I have time, I'll strengthen our case. So my time is gonna start now. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna start with their point that most nurses are actually not making enough money to live, but we say that the aggregate national salary of all nurses, no matter their certification, is $84,000 a year, which means that on average, obviously this isn't everyone, but on average, the majority of nurses are making a very livable wage that is above their price floor, meaning that the price floor just really isn't practical in this scenario. In addition, they said that we used California as our only point, but we did previously provide evidence such as this one for the fact that national wages are above $60K in most areas. Obviously, this isn't the case everywhere. In addition, we wanted to point out that there are other reasons why people are fleeing rural areas, but we said that the main issue here is that the shortage of labor, and I'll explain how we can solve for that in a minute. In addition, since the majority have a livable, or since the majority already have a livable wage, increasing benefits and making a 4-day work week, like our plan states, means that overall there will be more incentives than there already are compared to the proposition's plan, meaning that we will end up having more nurses overall, meaning that the issue of not enough nurses will be solved for on our side more effectively. In addition, we wanted to point out that compensation like this at the national level just isn't very practical. Though it is possible to pass and could go in place. Proposition themselves pointed out that wages differ in several ways between states. This means that overall, while our plan addresses issues that all nurses definitely have, as in paid time off and stress that we have shown with statistics are proven to exist, their plan solves for only some areas, meaning that it would be much more. Yeah.
So why is it viable to implement a 4-day work week on a federal level, but not to implement a pay for it?
I was getting to that. Since there are such big differences between salaries in states, like the proposition pointed out themselves, California is much different from Montana in how the nurses are paid. It means that it is much more practical for states to have their own individual legislation. Not only will this mitigate the economic effects of price floors, which my partner stated in the first speech, but also it means that there would be more effective legislation for nurses that actually need it in areas versus a federal level, versus our plan on the federal level would be room for states to pass these plans and give nurses additional benefits that can be passed at the federal level effectively. So because every, like we said before, every nurse is affected by stress, and therefore every nurse could use,
Given that the US has like a national minimum wage right now, why would it be infeasible to have one for nurses?
A price floor is different from a minimum wage. A minimum wage, specifically in like salary versus hourly wage, and obviously the cost of living is different. The minimum wage at the federal level is a general cost of living thing that all states could use, and because the cost of living has a minimum, like the lowest in the lowest state is the minimum, versus for nurse wages, they can be completely different, and it's in one profession. And in addition, the minimum wage does not have as many bad economic effects as most hourly jobs are not as affected by productivity loss from price floors and subsidies as high-paying, high-value jobs like nurses. And then I'm going to move on to strengthening our case. Moving just about our statistics about how about how new jobs would be created. We said that we found statistics that more employees are wanting more benefits packages versus wages, meaning that overall there are higher incentives for them to actually become nurses if they pass our plan, versus theirs, the salary may not matter to some, such as the ones here or some in New York, versus those that it will matter for would most likely get the same incentives out of our plan with it being more effective nationally. In addition, increasing these benefits instead of wages will reduce stress more overall, as as we said before, most nurses overall currently get a living wage, meaning that reducing stress in the workplace is the most important factor in reducing stress overall. And while our plan reduces stress in the workplace every day with more paid time off, lower weeks, and increased productivity, as we stated before, we have more nurses in the profession, meaning that there's less of a shortage that we are seeing as the one we are seeing right now, which means that overall our plan solves for stress better. In addition, like we said before, our plan improves well-being without damaging productivity, while price floors have been empirically proven by economists to reduce productivity, as it disrupts the natural flow of wages and supply and demand. In addition, like we said before, it already happens in other key fields, such as firefighters and police officers, and these key fields prove that these key fields get paid either less or the same amount as nurses, and make they have the same amount of stress or more stress with these with the same pay. This 4-day work week has been proven to reduce stress massively compared to the nursing to the plan of putting nurse subsidies. This means that overall putting these subsidies in place would mean less of a stress decline than our plan, and the stress decline from our plan would be more effective, as we had proven. In addition, we showed that there was a 1.4% increase in revenue overall for businesses, and since like the proposition stated, hospitals are struggling for funding, and like we stated, hospitals are struggling for funding, and an increase in productivity would mean overall not only do they make more profit, meaning they can reinvest more into retaining staff, but they can also mitigate some of those costs that the federal government would have to subsidize. And to add on, there's a 62% increase in, or 62% reported a better social life from a 4-day work week, which further improves quality of life. And then just to elaborate on our mutual exclusivity, by doubling pay for rural areas and mandating paid time off, the economy would significantly decline or collapse. Clinics do not. Many small clinics in rural areas just simply do not have the money to do this, and the money that the U.S. government's already running a deficit, meaning that the money is just not there, and increasing deficit spending decreases trust in the economy, meaning overall less stability, and that is why we are proud to oppose.
Okay, for the judge, I'm first going to be going over the counterplan and mutual exclusivity, then some framing and weighing, before going on to the key voter issues for this round. Cool. We as the opposition continue to negate, and our counterplan once again is the US federal government should increase the mandatory paid time off and benefits by implementing a 4-day work week for nurses. Specifically, I'm going to elaborate on how this is mutually exclusive. They say that they're trying to perm this, but we're saying that if you're doubling the pay for rural areas and mandating paid time off as well, basically they have to hire more nurses in order to get the same outcome of care, which means not only are they being forced to pay more money to these nurses, they're also having more nurses, which inevitably means that these clinics will collapse, and or either that, or if they're saying that there's subsidies directly from the federal government, which I'd like to point out, they don't directly say how much money they're providing in subsidies. They can't claim that subsidies, they can't stand on a slippery slope of subsidies without claiming how much money they're actually investing in subsidies. So their entire subsidy point should not flow through. But even if they do say, oh, there's an arbitrary amount of subsidies that I don't know, we're just guessing. Even if they said that you have subsidies, this would essentially collapse the U.S. economy or lead to recession, because you have high levels of inflation, you have high levels of deficit spending, and increasing the amount by such a large magnitude to double the amount of money that nurses in rural areas are getting paid simply wouldn't make sense. Okay, so on to some framing. We both agree that cost-benefit analysis should be the most important issue in this round. So specifically, since healthcare systems are basically trying to heal people and care for them, right? We should prioritize basically the quality of life of one, healthcare providers, and two, their patients. Those are the two most important issues in this round, and we will show how an opposition ballot guarantees them. Secondly, on some framing, specifically, you're going to be weighing the existing minimum wage, which is essentially the pay floor right now, versus their 60K minimum. Theirs is confusing and infeasible. They apply a mandatory standard to the entire of the United States, and it doubles wages in some areas and it's less than normal in other areas. So it just doesn't make sense. However, the reason why ours is more consistent and more applicable is because when you have paid time off, essentially the value of that paid time off it is the same. It depends on the wage that you're getting. And finally, here's some voting issues. Number one, quality of life for nurses. We cleanly win on this point, because just the fact that you have more money in your job doesn't mean that your quality of life will actually be increasing. Because the fact of the matter is most nurses are already able to sustain themselves. They're not starving. The reason that they're being have a low quality of life is because they're stressed, they're overworked, and they're burnt out. And we solve for this while they don't. Paid time off should be preferred to pure money, because quality of life cannot be improved by more money. If you have depression and stress, you can't be just well, you have money now, you can solve that. It doesn't work like that. When you have time that's taken off to rest and relax, you actually have less depression and less stress. Look to our empirics about how a 4-day work week is much more effective than a 5-day work week. The world's largest study that we cite had 92% success, 71% reduced burnout, 62% burnouts, better social life, and economic benefits from this. They have no refutation on this, saying that we just shouldn't prefer empirics because we're hiding behind them, but they don't have any empirics. Now, on the second issue of this round, rural areas. The main reason we say, first of all, for this rural flight is Roe v. Wade. However, even when you do have people leaving these rural areas, if you implement their plan, you won't have more people going to these rural areas, specifically because you'll have clinics that are closing down. If clinics aren't able to get the funding to provide 60K, they'll stop hiring as many nurses, and either that or they'll just simply go bankrupt. Where does the money come? They, once again, in their plan, do not specify how much money they have worth in subsidies. They simply say that they'll mandate 60K like a minimum wage. Okay. And then secondly, even if you buy the fact that they're saying that they'll implement subsidies, they're flawed. You have to jump through hoops and apply them. And we've already talked about the negative impacts of their plan, cost of living inequity, and inflation. And for this reason, we are so proud to oppose.
Sorry, okay. I'll be going over framing, plan versus a counter plan, and then like quick clearing up economy before moving into voters. Incredibly proud to propose the US federal government should impose a significant pay floor for nurses. On framing, we agreed on weighing on a cost-benefit analysis. So what does this mean here? We should look at the perm, but even on their highest ground, we tell you that the unique benefits of the plan versus the counter plan win us this debate anyways. First of all, let's look at the competition, right? What does either world actually look like? We told you in our plan that the US federal government would impose a pay floor and that the government would be able to afford these subsidies. First, I want to say that deficit spending impacts are not articulated on their side. Like, what is the importance of deficit spending increasing? We've been deficit spending as a government for so long. For example, like we just spent billions of dollars on an infrastructure bill, so presumably we can afford subsidies for a few rural hospitals. On funding, we tell you that hospitals will keep paying their workers and that subsidies would go to rural hospitals as they do in the status quo. This is fiated, and most of the refutation materials just saying that this like isn't very feasible. We tell you like first fiat, second, we already have a national pay floor, so I'm not really sure how this can't be imposed on a federal level. It's already historically demonstrated to be true. Third, they say that we have to give states room to adapt, which they do in their counter plan. But given that our plan is a standardized floor, not a ceiling, we can let these states adapt too. If they want to pay their nurses more, then like presumably they can do that as well. Also, they said that like we don't let nurses already earn a livable wage, and this is a significant increase from the status quo. First, note that nurses often don't live a livable wage. And the reason for this is that nurses have uniquely heavy financial burdens as compared to the average worker. Why is this true? Because they have to literally go through medical school, go into thousands of dollars of debt. So they do have to like spend more money. They are in more debt than the average person. They're also just more prone to burnout and longer shifts and things like that. We also tell you that this is a significant increase because California doesn't work as a universal example. And even if they like say that they use examples outside of California, we don't like look at most nurses on their side. We tell you that LVNs, which make up the bulk of the nurse population, have a $48,000 national average. So our $60,000 like increase is definitely substantial. But what did we tell you on the permutation? This was very important because if they lose this, we literally have already won the debate. Even if you say that the 4-day work week was like beneficial, then we like can agree and just do that on the government as well. So there are two ways that you can perm this. Sorry, I'm stopping time.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to put it in chat in case the judge was interested. That was a new point about like have it going into medical debt and like high economic burdens for nurses. So it shouldn't be allowed in the last speech.
So judge's discretion, but in our constructive, we said in our contention 3 uniqueness, the nurses have to go through nursing school. That's also a reason why there's no incentive to stay in the workforce. So also in our contention 1, and then Sebastian extended that when he like frontlined our case. But even so, there's 2 ways that you can perm their counter plan. First, literally do both policies by not spending more money. There's no necessity to spend more money if you do their counter plan as well. It's pretty obvious, right? You can give nurses 4-day work weeks and pay them a minimum of $60,000 a year for that 4-day work week schedule. That doesn't require extra spending on the part of the federal government whatsoever. But second, even if you do require more money to do this, which is very unclear, you can still spend more money. We tell you that the government and hospitals absolutely can afford this. They're turning high profits in the status quo. They don't provide you a break about how this specific amount of more spending creates a recession. We tell you that deficit spending is absolutely possible. They don't provide you a specific break and like actual articulation of why this perm doesn't work. So we already win on the perm. But then I want to articulate why we have unique benefits. First, I want to clear up economic issues and productivity, right? They tell you that hospitals can retain costs and have our productivity with shorter work weeks, and that our national floors disrupt the economy on government side. Firstly, it's very unclear as to why the productivity only increases with shorter work weeks and not increased wage. They can't have empirics without links. We tell you the citations aren't allowed in NPDL nationals, so if there's no link, don't buy the warrant. Secondly, they don't quantify or impact out the disruption to the economy in our world. Sure, there might be fluctuations, but it's literally because those who are not living a livable wage are now living a livable wage. They don't articulate why this is bad. We tell you that fluctuations like are inherently like maybe short term, but that's just because people are making more money. They also basically drop their inflation disadvantage. Sebastian tells you they can be true in combination with recession, but also like inflation is already existing, settling in the status quo, so don't disregard the impacts there. Our first voter is addressing the medical labor shortage. We told you that we're attracting people to nursing and maintaining current nurses. We also told you that we're preventing brain drain from rural states and ensuring that inner city hospitals actually have people working there, and there's going to be like benefits to the quality of life of the populations there. Essentially, what they say is that like they're on Roe v. Wade. We tell you like abortion is not going to be like the reason why these people are fleeing. Even this, if there's an alternative cause that doesn't engage with our link, that increasing this pay will keep people to stay in rural areas. They also say that like increasing benefits will reduce stress, but first, like these benefits are not competitive with wage increases. Second, we tell you that since nurse financial conditions are not like the average worker, they actually do care more about having enough money to put food on the table to pay off their huge loans. That was the unique quality of nurses that we address only on our side because we're actually giving them higher wages. Our second and very important voter was the benefits to patients and nurses. We told you that we're reducing hospital strikes, we're reducing worker turnover, and we're protecting nurses by ensuring that we're improving their quality of life. They don't engage at all about how nurses will have more luxury to afford basic necessities. Your professional life does, in fact, combine with your personal life, and the point at which you don't have the ability to afford basic necessities, you are more prone to burnout. They don't adequately address on there. So we do have no competition with their counterplan there, but also we completely outweigh on benefits to nurses as well as just turning medical labor shortages on that basis. Incredibly proud to propose.
All right, good round. I'm going to submit my ballot and then I'll give you all feedback. Sorry, can I have speaker orders?
Oh,
I'm Jace Williamson. I was the second speaker for op.
I'm Joshua Gabrielson. I was the first and third speaker for the opposition.
I'm Cami Hong. I was the first speaker for government.
I'm Sebastian Juarez. I was the second speaker for government.
Okay, just submitted my ballot. Good round for both teams. I ended up voting both. So the way I evaluated was, let's start. Okay, wait, hold on. Let me start with the plan text. First of all, I think the plan text is extra topical. The U.S. government will increase subsidies and management for nurse wages. That's definitely not extra topical. I think if you want to make that argument, you need solvency arguments as to why the United States federal government will do this. You do this in your responses later, and that's it's the bulk of the rest of the speech. But it's better to have it coming out of the 1AC. What you should have after your plan text is solvency for how you're going to be funding all this. Like usually, like after the POI, it should be pretty opposite. They're going to try to press you on funding. In which case, and usually with these sorts of minimum wage space, that's usually what happens. You should have this sort of argument right after, not in your plan text, because this does open you up to theory arguments, and I think I would be very amenable to theory arguments there. Conversely, the counterplan is also extra topical. The counterplan, the USFG should increase the mandatory paid time off and benefits by implementing a 4-day work week. Plan text doesn't say it's specific to nurses in the United States. Also unsure how they can mandate that. Especially the paid time off part. They can mandate the 4-day week part, but that's much harder to mandate, and you will have to get more solvency arguments. So on both sides of the house, like you need actual like solvency arguments on how this is going to be achieved. Which means that I look towards the perm. The negative goes for a perm by net benefits, mutual exclusivity by net benefits. Which is good. I went for that a lot in high school, so it's one of my favorite arguments. However, I think there needs to be more work done on why the perm is in net disadvantage. I think the reason why the perm is in net disadvantage should be coming out of the 1NC, especially since your case isn't too long. I think you should also start your case with the counterplan so that the organization of the 1NC looks a lot cleaner, because I think for the first half of your speech, I didn't really know where you're going with a lot of your arguments. I think you should just start with that. Obviously, like your theory, topicality arguments, that comes first on this speech, but on case, you should start with the counterclaim. Converse, right? So you should have like an actual like don't be afraid in the 1NC to actually have just a straight up disadvantage to the firm, right? Because the firm is the strongest argument the affirmative has to the counterclaim, and if the counterclaim is going to form the bulk of your case, which I think it does, then you should have a disadvantage ready and read. With that in mind, I think the perm makes sense here, and it's what I ended up voting on. I think the small disadvantage that the neg leads, which is that, like if you implement like a 4-day work week and a minimum wage for nurses, then you need more nurses. That's not necessarily I think you're losing on the government just fills in with subsidies argument. I think you need to press on that more with your economic disadvantage, and I'll get to that later. I think secondly, Neg needs to do more work to show why this is the case, right? AF points out that these are salaried workers, which means that you can just have like a 4-day work week and just like have them work more on the days that they're on, right? They're still working like 40 hours a week in a 4-day work week, right? So it shouldn't actually change the number of nurses that you actually need. There's also particular benefits for having nurses stay for longer shifts on a few number of shifts per week because it reduces turnover, which causes patient deaths. But that's neither here nor there.
Hey, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Our internet just cut out, so we missed the entire RFD. I'm just on my phone. Like the internet literally is like, it's gone. Could you maybe like give a summary for us?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Talking about how they're extra topical, and then
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, the plan is extra topical. The counterplan I think is also extra topical. Right, because it doesn't specify 4 nurses. Also like the solvency mechanism there is really unclear. Like how is the United States going to mandate a 4-day work week either overall? I think you should be more clear there, or if it's 4 nurses, like how is that going to fly a lot of people? Yeah. The counterplan should also have if you're going to go for like net benefits mutual exclusivity by net benefits, you should have like a section that's like an actual like straight up disadvantage to the firm coming out of the 1NC, especially because your case is really predicated on your counterplan outweighing, right? That being said, I ended up voting on the perm because I think it's the perm makes sense here, right? 4-day work week doesn't mean that you're working like 32 hours a week. It means that you're still working 40 hours a week, just 4 days instead of 5, right? Which means that you don't actually need to hire more nurses. I think the AF also, which the AF points out by saying that they're salaried workers, right? It's not by hours, it's by salary. But more than that, I think the economic fill-in argument by the subsidies makes sense, and I think you should press that more using disadvantage. You spend a lot of time on the disadvantage, but I think the disadvantage itself, and I think this is the biggest weakness with the 1NC case, the disadvantage itself is not actually like structured very stringently, right? Like you give me all these arguments saying that okay, we're on the brink of recession. It's like obviously we're on the brink of recession, but I actually don't know how inflation connects to recession. AF tries to say that inflations and recessions are mutually are like all opposites. That's not really true, but I think they get away with that claim because it doesn't go responded to that well. The argument that the neg should and this is feedback for everyone. When you set up an economic system manager, which I think is the best like backfile that's prep, it should basically go like, look, this one thing that we're looking at, which in your case is inflation, right? Inflation is going up really big. Increasing spending, increasing inflation. Here's why inflation is necessarily important for like the economy being stable, and then you get into like the impact stuff. Right, the way that you structure your disadvantage right now makes it so that the argument's a lot weaker because you're basically saying inflation is really big right now. We're just going to be increasing it more. That's really bad. But I don't get the actual like warrantation on the link level on like why does increasing inflation actually cause a recession? Like why does spending cause inflation? And most importantly, why does this spending cause inflation? You need to have much more specific warrants there because if you have those, you're basically winning the round. But you just need to be tighter on the disadvantage there. So for AF feedback, I think your plan is definitely exotopical. I think you need more solvency warrantation on why that's the case. I would have liked to see more weighing, I think, at the end of the round, but I also think it comes down to the sequencing debate. So this is like smaller feedback. Any questions for me? If not, y'all are free to go.
No, thank you so much for judging.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.